Hello, what's up everyone? Welcome to this live stream where we're going to have a look at a very cool document, Apple's official method to design and build an iOS app. So, like many things that Apple does on the documentation side, it can be sometimes a bit hidden. I've actually discovered this document only a few weeks ago. It was when I was doing live the tutorials on how to get started with Swift, and at some point in one of the recap web pages, there was this link to a keynote document that was called App Design Workbook. So I downloaded it and I saw that it was nothing else than a full-on methodology on how you should proceed if you want to create an iOS app. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess I need to talk about it at some point because it seems like a very, very, very exciting topic. Don't mind me, but I'm just checking that I'm indeed live because I have a small doubt. So I want to check. I just need to check my YouTube channel. I never remember how to do it when I'm on the app. Yes, okay, I'm live. Perfect. All right. So we are going to cover this slide deck. There is something like 100 slides, I think a bit more, and we'll see what this methodology is about. And more interestingly, we'll also see how it compares to our own experience, because some of us, we might be experienced enough that we've already seen the app creation process happening in real life when we were working at companies. Maybe some of you have also created your own apps, so it will be very interesting to be able to confront what Apple is showing with our own actual experience. And overall, it will just be interesting to discover this document and see what we think of it. So I'm going to go through the document live, but of course, if you want to download it, I've put the link in the description. So it's a link to get a Keynote file, and inside you have all of the slides. Welcome everyone in the chat. I see a few familiar names. Welcome Elner, welcome Frank. Let's have a look at this very cool document called App Design Workbook. So you can see it's called Develop in Swift, which shows us that the document is at least less than 10 years old. I'm saying that because I haven't looked at the document in details. I figure it would be much more interesting if I were to discover it live at the same time than all of you are also discovering it. So I just skimmed through it to make sure that it seemed like legit and there was enough to make an interesting live stream, but I don't know anything more than this first slide, basically. So what are they telling us here? They're saying, welcome, the app design workbook guides you through the app design cycle to help you bring your iOS app ideas to life. So it's really this methodology on how to turn an idea into an actual app that's on the App Store. You'll define, prototype, test, validate, and iterate on your design as you relate your design concept to the Swift code that powers iOS apps. So we can see, yeah, you can see my cursor, perfect. So you can see the steps: define, prototype, test, validate, and iterate. If you've ever read books like The Lean Startup, this might be bringing some memories because it's kind of like the same idea with a few extra steps, but it seems very, very similar. All right. I'm just looking at the chat to make sure that I don't miss any messages. So app designers spend a lot of time getting the look and feel of the app just right, but that's just one part of a much longer process. And design isn't linear. The best designs are refined and improved over time. Good app design begins with understanding the user and extends to every decision you make, both big and small. So design is not just about the look and feel of your app, it's more overall about how the app works and whether or not the app manages to efficiently solve the problem that it was aiming to solve. I say that in the sense that you can have an app that looks extremely pretty, but is basically unusable. Typical example would be an app with amazingly beautiful animations, but the animations take 2 seconds for every interaction, they're non-skippable, and basically the app becomes a pain to use on a regular basis. Behind every great app is an individual or team that started with an idea and a commitment to improve and refine it step by step. Get ready, you're about to take the first step in a rewarding journey. And so we'll learn about the app design cycle. So how to use this workbook? This workbook is designed so that you can customize it as you go. The result will be unique to you and your app, and it will reflect the decisions, all the decisions that you make along the way. You can add notes and highlights to exercises and bring in your own images and other resources. And I think that's why they made it as a Keynote document, because this way you can always add slides, you can add text, and basically it's meant to be a document that you're supposed to work on. You're not supposed to look at it, you're supposed to use it as a really like a template, just like a notebook, you're supposed to fill it as you go. So some slides include templates that you'll fill out, make as many copies as you need, so kind of like storyboards in a way. Slides marked with the app prototype icon indicate that you will work in a separate Keynote document to build your prototype, because you can build prototypes, you can build working prototypes of iOS apps in Keynote, because in Keynote you can add buttons that will redirect to other slides. Actually, I think there is even a session from WWDC from a few years ago, which showed exactly that, how you could prototype an iOS app using Keynote. And I know that Apple used to promote this approach also. And in a way, I mean, you can use Figma, but it's a way to do everything with one tool. And for someone who is just getting started, maybe also for non-technical people, using Keynote to prototype an ID might be easier than using Figma. And we have code explorations. Slides marked with the Swift Playgrounds app icon indicate that you'll dive into code in Swift Playgrounds. So they don't mention Xcode. So this might be a document that was made after they released, you know, like 2 years ago, something like January, February 2022, they updated Swift Playgrounds on iPad so that you could make an actual iOS app and ship it to the App Store with Swift Playgrounds. And maybe that's when they made this document, actually. We'll try to see if there is a year indicated somewhere. Just want to answer this question. So, hi, off the question. Will you make a stream or video about authentication in big apps? Specifically, how to handle auth only when it's required to fetch data, best practices, and architecture. I have some live streams about best practices and architecture, so you can check them out. You can search my YouTube channel. About authentication, I don't really have content because it really depends a lot depending on like the context, but I would say if you want to build something that's like future-proof and that works across iOS, Android, and also web apps, for instance, look at Firebase. Firebase for authentication is pretty nice and does a pretty good job. So what we'll need? So Swift Playgrounds, I'm sure you know about it. If you don't, it's an app that's available on macOS and also on iPadOS, which lets you write Swift code in a way that is a bit simpler than Xcode because you have less moving parts, we could say. Go Green prototype, so I don't know about this. So the examples on this workbook are based on Go Green, a demo prototype app, a demonstration app prototype in a Keynote file to simulate the app, play the slideshow, and click to advance through the screens. So actually, you know what? I'm going to download this document also because we might need it a bit later down the line. And iOS Keynote Kit, so it's another Keynote document which contains all of the, I guess, the graphical elements, you know, like the buttons, the tab views and everything to be able to prototype an iOS app in Keynote. So the basics of Keynote, they show us, okay, so you've got the navigator, okay. This indicates that you can fill these templates and you can add images to placeholder by dragging and dropping. All right. So what are the app design cycle steps? So defining, prototyping, testing, validating, and iterating. Okay. Let's start with define. So your journey starts by defining your app. An initial discovery process will help you identify the challenge you want to solve and understand your audience. Then you'll analyze how an app can tackle the challenge before building toward a list of goals, features, and key functions. So it's really the think before you build step. And this is super important because, as you can imagine, if you spend a crazy amount of time designing and then building something that actually makes no sense or doesn't solve an actual problem or that users are not interested in, you've basically wasted a ton of time. So it's better to spend time and try to iterate and correct mistakes as soon as possible. There is an analogy for it with like with airplanes flying, which is that if a plane has a 1 degree mistake from the moment it takes off, is going to arrive at a completely different place. On the other hand, if it has a 1 degree mistake 1 hour before reaching its final destination, is going to arrive also off, but much closer to where it wanted to land originally. So the bottom line of this is that it's okay to make mistakes and to be slightly off course, and you can never be perfectly on course. But the earlier you manage to fix to course correct, the more it will save you from having to make additional efforts, spending additional energy, and even additional money. Because at some point, when you want to make an app, most of the time it's for a business, and so when you're thinking about a business, time always ends up being money. Okay, so what do they say here in define? First, discover. So observe, explore your users, consider diversity, summarize your audience. So you'll begin by identifying a challenge and the people it affects. By the end of this stage, you'll have a thorough understanding of a challenge and an insight into the people who would benefit from a solution. Be observant and keep an open mind. The question you ask and the scenarios and points of view you imagine will determine the direction of your app and its ultimate success. Even if you already have an idea for your app, the following exercises can help you validate your current thinking. So this is super interesting because the part where you need to have an idea, and having an idea can be hard. And even when you have an idea, you still need to refine it in order to make the idea into a shape where it's exploitable. So this is something that I'm very interested in, because even though I don't have any project of being a indie hacker or creating my own app for now, you're kind of faced with similar challenges when you're doing content creation. And so I'm really curious to see how these ideas are laid out, because I'm sure that there are some of these ideas that I will be able to also reuse myself in my content creation process. So let's see. So observe, spark your imagination. People who create great apps are often motivated by addressing a challenge that they or their community experience. Create as many copies of this slide as necessary to capture your thoughts. Don't try to filter them too much. You never know which one will lead to a great app idea. So they ask you to think about, are there questions you or others think about often? What challenges do you or others face in your daily lives? Have you or others used workarounds in existing apps? Are there apps that partially address a challenge but require you to use them in unintended ways, or augment their capabilities using other apps or activities? So this can be very interesting when you're defining your project. And like I was saying, this works for apps, but it also works for any kind of activity where you want to create something that will be consumed by others, and you want to make sure that you build something that people are actually interested in. To kind of it's kind of like the line of Y Combinator, like build something that people want. Actually, this slide is orange, so it feels particularly appropriate to quote it, but it's basically the same idea being laid out here. And so the idea is that if you are actively building a project, or rather, if you're actively trying to define and refine a project for an app, so you would want to pause, stay on this slide, and then try to fill it as best as you can, because the goal of this slide is basically to give you a common thread, just to a common thread or a framework for the way that you think about your project. So it's about helping you reflect on your project, helping you ask yourself the right questions. I guess I'm not going to fill it because, to be honest, I don't have a really clear project of creating an app right now, but I can give you some ideas. Like, for instance, for me, I'm taking the example of my content creation, but it's about how can you share knowledge about iOS and Swift efficiently. So what are the challenges faced? It would be, for instance, how can you take an idea and make it into a way where it's easy to consume and people will want to consume it, for instance, because you don't want to have people spend 1 hour to just learn one little skill or one little trick. So it's basically the same kind of thought process that I went through to end up with my current video format that I have these days, where it's like 2 or 3 minutes, where it's very short. There is only one key idea. Sometimes it's aimed more towards beginners and intermediate developers than expert developers. And basically, I went through the same kind of process in my head when I was trying to also iterate and refine about how I should approach my project, which was a project of content creation. Then they say explore some code. So here it's about writing a hello world. So you're using the app design workbook because you have an idea that you want to turn into an app, but design isn't the whole story. Every app is built with code. The design and code of an app are related, maybe more closely than you might imagine. If you're new to coding, it might seem mysterious and complex. While it takes some time to learn the skills necessary to build an app from the top to bottom, the basic concepts and practices are easy to understand. The perspective you get from understanding even a little of the code behind an app will give you an advantage in the design process because it will give you an idea of what's feasible or not, and also what's easy to do and what's very hard to do. That's the typical, I would say, a gotcha or trap when you want to design an app and you don't know anything about how to code an app. Is that you can have some ideas that might seem great, but and they might be great actually, but you have no idea how incredibly complex they might be when it comes to implementation. And so having a small idea of what does it mean to build an app can help you refine your project. The goal is not to drop an idea because it seems too complex, but rather to say, okay, this is my idea, but it seems too complex, but maybe there is like a part of my idea that I can implement in a much simpler way, and I can get started like that. And then if I see that it works, then I can expand to the rest of the idea. You know, the idea of also like simplifying to make things easier to implement and to be able to put some things into the hands of your users faster. That's great. But in order to simplify, you kind of need to know what's hard. Otherwise, it's impossible to simplify if you don't know what's hard. I mean, you can still remove stuff, but you will be doing randomly. And so it will not be a good way to simplify something, because when you want to simplify, you do want to remove the hard part without taking too much of the essence of the concept. So in this and future exercises, you will discover how Swift code, the same language used by professional app developers around the world, powers the features of an app. One last thing, don't worry about mistakes. All coders get stuck, from the newest beginner to the most seasoned expert, I can confirm. You won't need any of the code from these exercises, so use them to play, explore, and get curious. Get ready to write your first lines of Swift. So I think I'm going to skip a bit about this part because I think most people watching the videos on my channel already have some knowledge of coding and Swift and iOS, so I think it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to spend too much time on these slides. But if you're new to Swift and iOS, please do take the time to understand. It's super important to have a strong technical knowledge before you start a project of creating an app. Even if you don't intend to be the one that is the technical person who implements the app, you do want to have a basic understanding of how it works, because you cannot be someone that designs and operates a technology product if you have no idea how the technology that powers this product works. So let me skip this part. Okay, then there is the part about exploring your users. So also what can be called as building, not really building a persona, because a persona comes after. A persona is the idea of having like this ideal user. Here it's about asking real people, interviewing real people in the real world, and asking them questions in order to understand the challenge that they face and how you can help them solve these challenges. So what do they say? Pick one of the challenges and gather information about individuals who experience it. Each person is different. It's important to think broadly to capture as much diversity as you can. Good design is user-centered. You've gotten a good start by thinking about the challenges that you and others face. So, but it was still very like, how do I say it? Not solitary, but self-centered way of thinking, in sense that at the previous slide we were thinking but in isolation, and of course at some point you do need to confront your thinking to the real world, and you want to do it as early as possible. Otherwise we end up in a kind of situation which I mentioned before, where you might need to course correct, but very late, and so in a very costly manner. So keep it going. By narrowing down from the general to the specific, you'll place individual people at the core of your process. Personal stories from real people can give you perspective you might not otherwise have, and they can also give you motivation that you might not otherwise have. Consider interviewing people from your community to create authentic profiles. And it could be a real world community, or it could also be online community, of course. So example here, who is this person? How do they describe themselves? So a father of two, kindergarten teacher, taking online classes in photography. So you can see that there is something about like family situation, job, and then either hobby or maybe something that does relate to the problem. But it might not be the case because this doesn't seem to be linked to the rest of the problem. How old are they? Because different generations will have a different take on the problem and also on what they would be willing to put up with or to learn in order to solve this problem. So what are important aspects of their environment? So here, live in an apartment on the third floor, not enough space for large bins in the house, so they only have a small recycling container. So we can see that the problem seems to be around recycling. So how do you describe the challenge they face? I don't really understand what's recyclable and what belongs in the trash. That's indeed quite a problem that I also often have. The labels are hard to find. I don't really know how to distinguish between things like different kinds of paper. What do they most want in a solution? How will it make their lives easier? I need help quickly identifying what's recyclable. If I could search through items quickly every evening, I'd be more likely to spend mental energy on it, since my kids deserve as much energy as I can give them. In which circumstances might they use an app that addresses their challenge? I could spend little time every evening with my kids sorting through our daily waste. So the challenge is that the person would like to get better at recycling, but it's hard to know which should go in which bin, and they don't have also a lot of room in their house to have a lot of recycling containers. And so maybe an app could be something that helps, maybe by reading the labels automatically and suggesting, for instance, what should be done in order to recycle the product. And so, of course, then you have the slide, which is the blank template, which you should use if you have an app creation project to interview people from your community, as we said, either in the real world or online. Then I talk about consider diversity. So identify things about your users you may have overlooked. A user's identity and circumstances will have a huge impact on how they'll experience and use an app. Summarize all your users with these different aspects in mind. Everyone has biases that affect the way they perceive the world. Compensate for your biases so that they don't creep into your app's design. Did you identify something that you didn't consider when imagining your audience? For instance, were all your users of similar age? Consider going back to the earlier exercises with your new insights in mind. I know they give you some criteria to consider, so ages, genders, languages, disabilities, cultures, economic circumstances, and living situations. Typically, we take the example of the problem of recycling. Someone who has a big house with a lot of room in the garage for recycling containers is very different from someone who lives in a tiny apartment in a big city, typically. Also, not all cities or counties might have the same rules for what's recyclable or not. Same thing depending on countries. Of course, older people might be less likely to use a technological solution to solve a problem than younger people. Children might be more willing to engage with something if it feels more like a game, and maybe adults will be more willing to engage with something if they feel that they have a positive impact on the world, or they are learning something. So all of these things are worth keeping into mind. And I guess you want to try and get as much diversity as you can. You might want to exclude some parts of the equation at first. For instance, let's imagine you're an American. Maybe you might consider, okay, I'm going to consider that my app project is just for the US. This way it simplifies a bit. It doesn't necessarily simplify everything in terms of language, for instance, because in the US, many people speak Spanish, for instance. So you still need to take that into account. But I would say you want to consider that you might not want to target the entire world with a fully localized app when you're getting started. It's okay to reduce the scope a bit also in terms of which audience you're targeting. And so, of course, as you reduce the scope, some of these criterion will be either less relevant or maybe even completely irrelevant. For instance, if you make an app, typically in France, where I live, the language part would be mostly French, and that would be it, basically. So that's something that can also simplify a bit how you work. Then they say summarize your audience. So summarize your findings about individual users, refer to your earlier research, and use it to draw some conclusions. So here, what's the most important concern in a solution? Understanding the percentage of trash versus recycling. So being able to have this like measurement and maybe to be able to maybe improve the measurement over time. That's interesting because when you have measurement, you can do a lot of interesting stuff. You can draw charts, you can do rankings, you can offer like a view that compares yourself with other users in the same area. So when you have a KPI, you can usually do some very interesting things. The age range of users who might be interested in the app will be from 15 to 30. Our app will be open when throwing things in the trash or recycling. So that's interesting because it means that then the feature of the app will need to be able to be used very easily, because if people are using the app on the go, on the moment, you can't afford to have the app be have some mandatory steps which prevent the user from just accessing the feature that they are interested with. Our app will be used in this environment, so inside with connections to Wi-Fi or cell reception. So that simplifies the problem a bit because we don't need to handle offline mode at first. But on the other hand, our environment will have these limitations, like users may have their hands full. So it means that navigation in the app will need to be super easy, typically being able to navigate with only one hand when holding the device, and so only with the area that's reachable by the thumb will be super important. And when designing our app, we need to consider users might not know what qualifies as a recyclable, so you cannot expect users to know, to be experts, or even have some basic knowledge of the field, in the sense that if you were to create an app on how to recycle and what's recyclable or not, in the process of creating the app, you will of course gain a lot of domain knowledge of what's recyclable or not. But it's important to keep in mind that while your knowledge of the domain will increase quite a lot, it will not be the case at all for your users. And it's something that's very hard to actually keep in mind. So that's one of the reasons why people who build apps do user testing, in order to get feedback from users who haven't become as accustomed with their own app as they have. Because when you work on an app for several months, you know it by heart, and you tend to overlook issues that might be quite big for users that are still discovering your app. A good example to see it is people who are maybe my age, so around 30, might remember that back in the days, video games used to be really hard, and there were two reasons for it. The one reason was that you could run video games, and so they were making them harder so that you would need to run them more than once, but also because video games were made sometimes by 1, 2, or 3 people, very small teams, and the developers would become expert at playing the game, and they wouldn't realize that the average player is a kid who doesn't have the inner knowledge of how the game works, and basically they would not realize that their games were super hard because they were not doing any kind of user testing. So if you're my age and you've experienced that situation, I think that's very helpful to be able to understand how it can be frustrating when a developer has completely lost touch with how hard their app or their code can be to use, just because they are working on it every single day, and so they just no longer see it with the eyes of someone who has just discovered it. Same thing. So you have the template here. Okay. Then you analyze. So now that you've identified who your app serves and the challenges they face, it's time to get specific. By the end of this stage, you will have a clearer picture of the form your app might take. You'll look at the root causes of your users' challenges, and you'll use them to drive feature ideas that take advantage of key iOS capabilities, while contrasting your ideas with existing apps. So we can start to talk about basically analyzing the competitive landscape. So let's see. Dig deeper into the issues you've observed and find the core problem. Then consider how your app could solve it. Asking why something happens will help you discover hidden causes behind what you observe directly. The deeper you dip, the closer you'll get to the core motivating need for your solution. Create as many copies of the following template as you need to describe the problems you've identified in your research. And so users are having this problem, so they'd like to begin recycling but struggle to hold themselves accountable. This happens because it's easier to throw everything into one bin. I can relate to that. This is because they struggle to differentiate between trash and recycling, which is because recycling seems complicated and hard to remember, and the root cause is the core problem. People are rarely taught how to recycle. We can solve this issue in our app by educating people on what qualifies as recycling and gamifying the experience so that they can hold themselves accountable with their peers. So we can see some of the ideas that I was mentioning just before starting to be spelled out. And this way of thinking is very useful. It's something that you can find also. You might have heard something called like the 5 why method, which is that when you take something that someone tells you as their problem and you ask why 5 times, then you end up on what is the underlying root cause. That is what people really care about, but they don't mention it because it's something that is maybe a bit too abstract or a bit too shameful sometimes, but it's something that publicists and people who make ads use a lot, because when you want to make an ad, you want to make the ad for what people really care about, but that they don't usually say when you ask them. So they need to dig deeper to understand the underlying motivations of people, and then they make ads that match these underlying motivations. The typical example they give you often in textbooks is that if you want to make an ad for a power drill, you don't make an ad about just doing drills in the wall, but maybe you make an ad about being able to decorate your house as you want, or being able to install furniture reliably for your kids and your family. This kind of thing. Basically, no one wants to buy a power drill. They want to buy the ability to fix something on their wall. That's basically the same kind of idea that is being laid out here. So that's interesting, because if you've read some methodology to solve some problems, you always, all of these methodologies, they all operate on the same basic ideas. So if you've had courses or read books about such methodologies, like I was mentioning the Lean Startup earlier, you will probably find similarities, because the idea is often the same, and then it's the tools that differ a bit, but the core steps behind it, they are always very, very similar. So that's the template that you will need to fill for your own app ID. And then they talk about researching competitors, so what is often called also as benchmarking. So find and describe apps that relate to the problem you've identified, discover what people are currently using to solve the problem, search the App Store for similar apps to find out what users enjoy or dislike about their solution. This will give you insight into what your app will be competing with. Here they do a very App Store-centric benchmarking, but I would also say it would be good to also investigate what people might be using that is not app or even technology related. Because if we take the example of recycling, maybe people typically, when a city wants to encourage recycling, they will give pamphlets or leaflets that summarize with maybe one sheet of paper what is recyclable or not, and maybe people have this being displayed over their garbage bin, and maybe that's how they deal with the problem. So it's good to do app-centric benchmarking, but not all problems are solved with apps, and so you still want to have a large picture. So please also try to do some benchmarking that is not app-centered, because otherwise you might miss quite an interesting, important information. Because typically, what I was mentioning for the recycling, the fact that these leaflets do exist is a big part of the problem, or rather of your solution. I mean, the problem they are not a problem, but they're part of the problem space. And you probably want to either take inspiration from them, want to understand what they do well and integrate it, understand what might be missing and try to improve on it, but you definitely don't want to ignore them. So do app benchmarking, but don't only do app benchmarking, do benchmarking on a more global competitive aspect, I would say. Then they do something that is very iOS related, which is try to look at how iOS can help you solve the problem better. So trying to know the iOS capabilities that you might use in your app. iOS comes with an array of great technologies for addressing how users want to interact with an app. You'll see many listed here, but keep in mind that there are many more. And also, these capabilities, they are also what makes the difference between a website and an app. So if you're building an app and not a website, you probably want to leverage these capabilities, because otherwise it brings the question of why are you building an app and not just a website, which might be easier to build, that will be available on iOS and Android. So if you see that you cannot find a single capability that your app can leverage, that might be the sign that maybe you should be more building a website than an app, to be honest. So also think about what features your competitors have in common that you might need to use in your app, which features might be game changers. And I talk about visiting the iOS Human Interface Guideline site and look at user interactions and system capabilities to learn more. So you've got the map, which can be very useful. The NFC, of course, if it makes sense, NFC can be one of the big added feature of using an app. Anything about augmented reality, if it makes sense. This could make sense typically for someone who is selling furniture. Typically, if you have a 3D model of the furniture, then people can place it into their home and get a sense of how it looks like. Also for some kind of clothing, I know for instance that I don't know if there's an app that does it, but the Ray-Ban website allows you to see how the glasses would look on your face, and I find that the result is quite good. Not as good as trying the glasses for real, but when you're buying online, honestly, it's better than nothing, and I find that it was working quite well, to be honest. So that's the kind of capability that you can add. Image processing, so if you do any kind of image recognition or image processing on the device, speech recognition, haptics, machine learning, camera, Bluetooth, GPS, context menus, so anything that can give you a better ergonomics than what a website offers, microphone and speakers, drag and drop, so once again, having a nice UI, accelerometer and gyroscope, widgets, and notification. And I'm sure there are even more capabilities, but these are already a good amount. And I would say, definitely, if you don't find any of these capabilities, if you don't find that any of these capabilities, so not a single one, makes sense for your app project, once again, it might be a sign that you should build a website rather than an app, to be honest. Okay, so then there is a bit about coding in order to display maps. So I'm going to skip this because I think it's not the most interesting for this live stream, but I do encourage you to try and do it if you've never written any Swift code, because it's a good way to get started without too much stress. And we move on to the part about planning. So finding differentiators, defining features, prioritizing features, describing key functions, and defining an MVP. So we get much more to what you could find in any kind of project methodology, I would say project planning methodology, and with a bit also of marketing, because here differentiators is a typical concept of marketing. So what do they say? They say that we are now ready to put together a concrete plan for our app. By the end of this stage, we'll have a concise, well-defined plan that we can begin building into a prototype. We'll build our plan by identifying key differentiators, setting goals, and then narrowing down our feature set to exactly those we'll need to test whether our app will impact real users. So we're starting to see this idea of simplifying, as I was mentioning a bit before, and we also see this mention of MVP. So MVP, if you've never heard the term, it means minimum viable product, and basically it's the minimum product that you can create, in the sense the product that requires the least amount of work, but that is still viable enough that you can show it to someone and someone can validate whether or not the product makes sense for their need. And if you've read the Lean Startup book, this is one of the core ideas of this book. And if you haven't read this book, I would recommend that you read it after this live stream, because it's a very, very interesting book with some really nice ideas that you can apply to it was meant to building companies, building startups, but you can also apply it honestly to like content creation, even to like how you handle your own career. It's a very, very interesting book with ideas that can be applied in a wide range of situations. So finding differentiator. So create a list of ways your app will be different from existing apps. So how do you differentiate from competitors? Your app's differentiator sets it apart from others in the market. A differentiator is a core feature of your app. The following things are not differentiators: style, such as colors, fonts, icons, and images, arrangements of items on screen, and how screens are organized. And I think here what they want to do is they want to avoid the trap of thinking, oh, I will do the same thing with a different design and it will feel different, which often is not the case. When people are already using a product, they have no reason to switch to another product. Usually the saying is that when you want people to switch from an existing product to your product, you either need to do something completely different or you need to do 10 times better. And it's way easier most of the time to do something completely different than to do 10 times better. Doing 10 times better is often quite hard, not to say maybe even impossible in many situations. Also, that's something that you read more in marketing books, but differentiators, often it's something that you should be able to negate. A differentiator should be negatable. What do I mean by that? Is that if you say that my differentiator is that my app will be easy to use, then that's a problem, because if you try to negate it, it would be my differentiator is that my app will be hard to use. It's hardly something that you want. So basically, a good differentiator is something where the opposite would also make sense. A good example is to say, it's more for luxury product, but luxury product, they say a differentiator is that they are very high quality and very expensive. And you can also say, I want my products to be much more affordable, but at the price of sacrificing a bit of quality. Both make sense. Both answer to different needs and different market segments, but you can negate high quality, high price, and still do something successful, something that makes sense. That's why it's a differentiator. On the other hand, saying like my app will not crash if your app crashes is not possible to be successful, basically. So that's also something to keep in mind. In the sense that a good differentiated feature is a feature that a competitor might choose not to do, and it could still make sense for them. This also has a consequence. It means that with differentiators, there is the idea of risk, because since it could make sense to also not do it, it means that only one of the two options can be true, and it's hard to know which. But I'm sorry if it's a bit confusing the way I've phrased it, but if you have any questions and you're watching live, don't hesitate to ask in the chat, by the way. But basically, so a differentiator could be, for instance, there is an app. So let's talk about like this recycling situation. There is an app that shows like what the main rules for recycling are. Maybe a differentiator is being able to scan a product, either the product itself or maybe its label or maybe its barcode, and from that being able to display some clear instructions on how to recycle it. This is a differentiator because there is a cost to creating the underlying database or model that will give the information. So a competitor might say, no, I won't do that because I think it's too costly and I will take another approach. So that's why it would be, I would consider it a true differentiator. But saying my app will use blue colors, whereas my competitors use green colors, that's not a differentiator at all. It could be also like the device that you support. I don't know, like saying, for instance, I will support the Vision Pro. I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense because I'm not sure a lot of people do the trash while they're wearing such an expensive and fragile device. But for another kind of app, it could be saying, okay, I will differentiate by supporting maybe exclusively the Vision Pro, and I will focus my efforts on this. That's also a true differentiator. And once again, here they show how to think of your differentiators against other apps. That's true, and that's a great thing to do. But if in your discovery phase, in your interviews, you've seen that people use other means than apps to solve their problem, you also want to think of how you differentiate against these other means. Once again, if there is a one-pager sheet that sums up what is recyclable and not recyclable in a given neighborhood, you do need to think about a way of how your app differentiates against it, because it's way easier to look at a sheet of paper displayed on the wall than take out your phone, open an app, navigate to the right screen, etc., etc. So you do need to think about it. So don't only think in this app-centric way, but definitely do think in terms of differentiators. And if you have a big competitor that's already established and you don't have a clear differentiator against them, you probably have a problem also. And you might want to find a differentiator, because otherwise, what's the reason why people should use your product and not the one that's already well established, probably already has a community, has a brand, and everything like that? By the way, they also showed us a bit before that the part about thinking about diversity. Diversity can be addressing diversity can also be a great differentiator. Maybe you see that in the case of your problem space, the problem is the way to solve the problem is very different from country to country. Maybe addressing a specific country where the problem isn't well solved for now might be also an interesting differentiator. So you want to relate this to everything that you've learned before on the problem space. Okay, then there's a bit of code about model and view. I really like how they alternate between more like research phases and then technical phases, so that if someone that is completely new wants to learn how to build an app, they will not get discouraged by having too many like technical steps as a prerequisite. So I really like how they've structured these steps. Okay, then it's about defining features. So you want to summarize the baseline and differentiating features of your app. Establish clear, achievable goals helps you focus on the problems you're trying to solve and the way you're hoping to solve them. All of your previous research will help you define the basic features and differentiators of your app. So current recycling apps have focused primarily on what is considered recycling. As a baseline, our app will need to log trash and recycling. So this idea of keeping track of things, having data that we can then use to store KPIs, show charts, let people know if they have improved or not, let people know how they compare against their peers. So these are the what they call the baseline features. So log trash and recycling, educate about what is recyclable, so kind of links to here, this is what competitors do. Host a storefront from environmentally friendly products. Scan product barcodes to determine recyclability. So I had a good idea, but we have a very similar app in France, not for recyclable, but to know like if there is any harmful ingredients in food and cosmetics. So that's why I thought about this. Provide quick links to environmental causes. Provide a breakdown of trash versus recycling. So also these two are linked to what is already done by the existing recycling apps. And our app will be different by encouraging recycling through gamification. That's indeed a good differentiator, because also you could say, an app could say, we won't be gamifying because we want to focus more on educating and providing explanations, providing scientific commentary. So that's a very good differentiator. Creating challenges to spark ideas. So that kind of goes a bit with gamification, but it's still also a good differentiator. Communicating with smart bins to calculate weight automatically. Also a good differentiator, maybe a more complex one, but a good differentiator. And host a storefront for recycling supply bins, bags, and magnets. So a bit similar to what there was here, but I guess here it's more specific in what's going to be sold. Okay, so that's the template if you want to fill it with your own app ID. So then a bit of a technical part about strings, one of the basic types of Swift which represents text and which is very important to understand, because it's basically one of the most basic building block of apps. Virtually every app out there handles strings. Whenever you need to display text, you need to handle strings. And it's very important to understand about strings, even if you're not technical, because basically the way strings work is responsible for what could be perceived as limitations, but basically apps are conditioned by the way that technical foundation works, and strings make up for a good part of that technical foundation. So by understanding how strings work, you understand quite well on how an app works. And the fact that, for instance, here they show examples about how do you put a numerical value in the middle of some text. By showing how it works, you understand better how it works. You understand, for instance, that handling plural is not magical and it needs to be implemented somewhere. So it's a good way to build a strong understanding of what an app can do, what it cannot do, what's easy, what's hard, and basically what I was mentioning earlier in the live stream. Okay, now prioritizing features. So make a copy of the previous exercise, annotate the most important features, and order them by priority. Ask yourself which features are absolutely necessary. Can you pare your list down to 3 or 4 key features? I did not know this verb, to par or to pair. I don't know. I guess it means reduce, reduce to, but I didn't know this verb. Do you need to reorder your priorities? Identifying the most important features of an app helps you work toward your minimum viable product, so MVP. Your first iteration of the app should include just the features necessary to validate your idea. To avoid feature creep, so when there is too many features and it overwhelms the users, it's important to distinguish between must-have features and those that would be great enhancements. Clear minimal focus is essential to the success of the design process. Think, for instance, when Instagram started, you could only take a picture and apply a filter to it. There were no stories. I don't think there were DMs back then. So you could only create a profile, post pictures, add filters to them, and that was basically it. So Instagram, when it released around 2010, 2011, was definitely an MVP when you compare it to what Instagram is today, where you have stories, you have reels, you have carousels, you also have all of the features where brands can put links to buy clothing items or bags or jewelry that you can see in the pictures. So, but if Instagram had done all of that in the beginning, they would have never launched early enough, and they would have also never been able to start creating a user base, because the time to market is super important. And so this is what it helps you. This, they don't mention it, but this helps you reduce your time to market. I mean, they say it when they say that you need to be able to validate your idea as fast as possible. And the way that it's said and phrased often is with these words. So time to market is the time needed to confront your app to the market to see whether or not the market, the audience, likes your app, whether you can build some momentum, get some traction or not. And the easier you can do it, the easier and the earlier you can do it, then the faster you will also be able to course correct, and the more likely you are that in the end you will be able to create a product that users like, validate, and are genuinely excited about. So here they've ordered the features. So logging trash and recycling is the basic feature. Educating about what's recyclable is also one of the basic features, but still less important. And then it's the gamification part that makes sense to have differentiators here, and creating challenges to spark ideas. So I kind of agree with the prioritization, because these are the easiest to create. And I would say it's very important in your MVP that you include both baseline features but also differentiators, because remember, differentiators are what makes your app unique. So if you don't have any differentiator in your MVP, it might be hard for users to understand why you're different than from what they are already using or not using because they don't like the current offering. And you can see that some features that make a lot of sense are actually prioritized quite later. Like for instance here, being able to scan a product barcode to determine recyclability is great. But for that, you need to build a database, and it's going to be super long, super costly. There might even be legal issues behind it. So it makes sense to to prioritize it pretty low on the list. On the other hand, being able to log what you trash and recycle can be easy to do. It could be just by taking picture of it. It could be by writing by hand, having some pre-filled like buttons to say, okay, I've put this in the trash, I've put this in the recycle. Like for instance, counting how many plastic bottles or metal bottles you've recycled. That's quite easy to do. Educating also is quite easy because often you can do it in ways where, like, for instance, you just put a web view towards like relevant web pages or relevant PDF documents. And basically, when you do it like that, it's more like you're putting a relevant document and you're doing a more of a curation job than a content creation job, but that's also can be a great way to get started. And then gamification, the differentiators, you want to have them early on because since this is what you plan to rely on to attract and retain users, well, first you need it in order to attract and retain them, but also you want to confront your users to these features to see whether or not it does make sense for you, for your users, whether or not these features resonate with your users. And one thing they don't mention, but I guess they will mention it probably later, but you want to have a way to measure how users are interacting with your app. That's the big idea of the Lean Startup book. And so you want to build some kind of analytics into your app so that you can know, okay, how are users interacting with my app? Do they stop using it after 1, 2, 3, 4 days? Do they keep using it after 1 week? When do they use it? Do they use it like in the morning, in the evening, throughout the day? It's super important because unless you implement analytics, you will have no way of knowing how your users are actually using your app. All you will be able to rely on is what they will tell you, but it might not be the full reality. They might lie, they might just misrepresent in an honest way, but they might misrepresent reality. Like you ask me how I use Instagram, I will never be able to give you a complete picture because I use it in different ways. Some that I might be aware of, some might be very unconscious, but maybe sometimes I see something on Instagram and then it drives a purchase decision for me weeks later and I don't realize it on a conscious level. So you do want to have analytics because it gives you, I don't want to say it gives you an objective way of how users are using your app, but it gives you the closest you can get to an objective way of how users are using your app. However, it's also important to ask users about how they feel about the app because that analytics cannot tell you about it. And you can see often, typically in marketing books, you have the opposition between qualitative feedback and quantitative feedback. Analytics is quantitative feedback, and talking with users, interviewing users is qualitative feedback. Okay, then you want to describe the key functions. So for each priority feature, so what is in orange, describe its key functions, copy and paste this slide as many times as you need, list information the user will see and actions that the user will take. So it's kind of like trying to describe what the screens of the app will contain, but without designing yet because design is costly and you want to only do it once you have a clear picture. So add notes to clarify your thoughts and or ask questions that you'll want to come back to as you work on your design. Don't think in terms of user interface yet. Elements such as buttons, tabs, and icons are supported and defined by the data and actions in your app. The better you understand them, the better your designs will fit your MVP features. So in the example, for the feature of logging trash and recycling, the user will need to be able to do these things. So add a log entry, describe the items, keep record of past items, choose the day that recycling was done, default to today's date. So you can see that you can also think about some like quality of life features to make the feature easier to use, browse past date, share log entry to social media, and in the notes, so when you add the log entry, you need to be able to select either the weight or the item. When you describe the item, how much they recycled on what day, keep records of past items, so day, weeks, and months to have some kind of like a view where you can analyze the data, and default to today's date might need a quick jump to today. So the idea of having a shortcut button in the app for what will really be like the main flow of the app. And then defining an MVP. So go back to your describe key function slides or duplicate them and prioritize the most important and crucial functions to implement for each feature. So it's kind of like we did the MVP at the feature level and now it's at the function level. So also inside each feature, try to understand what's the most important and what can be done later. So it's kind of like the MVP of the MVP. We dig one level deeper and then we reapply the methodology one level deeper. And if you've read any kind of engineering methodology, you also often have this pattern of basically methodologies. They're a way of trying to rationalize what goes in, what goes out, and how the transformation is made. And so you put things into boxes, and then you open each box and you reapply the same process inside the box until you've reached like atomic operations, basically. So you'll base your MVP on the features you identify here. Remember that you're not your user. If you get stuck, think about what would most help the user achieve the goals you identified. And I would say also, if you can talk to users to ask them if you have a doubt, also, it's worth doing it. Don't always rely on users, of course, because users might, I mean, when you're asked about something, you tend to think about in the present. It's very hard for someone to project themselves into the unknown. It's kind of like it's the quote from Henry Ford who says like, if I had asked what people wanted, they would have told me they wanted faster horses. Because thinking about an automobile when you're only surrounded by horses is very hard and nearly impossible. Just like 10 years ago, thinking about a device like the Vision Pro was super hard, or in the 90s, thinking about a device like a smartphone and that you will be able to like call a Uber just like that with your smartphone, that was very hard to think about it for a regular person who is not whose main activity is not to try to think about futuristic use cases. So here you can see that they put add log entry as number 1 feature, describe item as number 2, keep the record of past items as number 3, choose what day recycling was done as number 5, default to today's date as 4. So actually this one goes before, so they've kind of like mixed the order. So I think they didn't put the right order here, but I would say it makes sense that defaulting to today's date as a first feature makes sense. First, you consider it's always today, and then you add the choice to change the date. Browsing past dates as 6, and sharing to social media, indeed, it's 7, and it's not a priority because if you want people to share on social media, they first need to use your app and be excited about it. So it makes sense to first build a strong set of core features in your app and then think more about spreading the word and how your users can share social media and basically through it share the word about your app. I'm gonna take an example like apps about like workout. I think about like Strava, for instance, which allows you to share your workout or your running session on social media. I can imagine that first they had to nail how they were storing and recording the workout or the running session, and then only once they've done that correctly, focus on how to share it. Because also in order to share something, you need to first have recorded it in a way that is reliable. If you don't have a good way to record something, then how are you going to share it in a way that makes sense? That's not possible. So it's also a question of like, you know, like not like doing things in order. In France, we have a saying that is like, don't put like the hawks behind the carriage, basically. Will the live be I'm a bit tired. I think that's when you say that I'm a bit tired when I struggle to speak. Will the live be available for late spectators? Yes, as usual, there will be a replay. As soon as the live stream is over, there will be a replay available with the same link. So don't worry. And I will even tomorrow add chapters so that it's easier to access each part of the live stream. Okay, we finished the first part about designing. And it took us 1 hour. So there were 6 parts, so I will not stay for 6 hours on this live stream, but anyway, I would say it made much more sense to focus on the early part about about designing and prototyping than the part about implementing, because as developers, we are much more likely to be already familiar with these parts already. It's much more our comfort zone, I would say. And in terms of length, I think I will last for 2 hours for this live stream. I won't do more than 2 hours because, you know, after 2 hours, it's a bit too long, both for me and for the audience. So we move on to prototyping. So it's time to build a working Keynote prototype of your app. Very exciting because it's a technique that we can also reuse in our daily work. You'll start by mapping screens to form an app architecture. So basically, kind of like a storyboard in Xcode, for those who remember. Then apply basic UI elements to create a wireframe. Then you'll refine your prototype by using common design guidelines to ensure that it meets an iOS user's expectation. And finally, you'll define the personality of your app with color, icons, and more. Okay, so they give the example of oh no, it's not an app about map, it's about making a map of your app. So an app map is a set of outlines that describe information and functions on each screen and how they relate to each other. By the end of this stage, you'll have a set of screens outlines with well-defined groupings and relationships. By mapping your app, you define its architecture. iOS users have a set of expectations, a mental model, for the way an app should behave. They expect related information to be grouped together and for activities to be easy to navigate. Typical example is when you want to add a new piece of data to a collection, usually you're given a model to fill in a form that will add the data. So you'll derive your app's architecture from the key functions of the MVP, making decisions based on how you expect users to work with the app. So typically, your key features will be the features available in the tab view of your app. What's interesting with this like map app approach is that if you've ever studied any kind of software design methodology, I know when I was a student in France, I studied a few of them. You always have a similar idea of building a general map of what you're attempting to build. Of course, the map will always focus on different things. Here, I guess there will be a heavy emphasis on navigation inside an iOS app. So navigation according to the patterns in the iOS human interface guidelines. But you always have this common thread of creating this big document which contains the big screen of your app and how they relate to each other, how you navigate to each of them, and which data they store and which data they make accessible for the user. So outline screens. Review the key functions of your MVP and organize them into screens, describing the content and actions of each. The key functions you listed have natural relationships that suggest which ones belong together. Feel free to break up a function into more than one item in a screen outline. Or combine several key functions into one item. Your notes will help you make these decisions. Try to keep each screen focused on a single concept or activity, summarized in its title, without worrying about how many there are. Next, you'll organize them in a way that users understand. You'll work with these outlines in the map stage. During the wireframe stage, you'll translate your screen outlines into text, images, controls, icons, and other UI elements in your app. So it's already a stage where you start to design your app, except that instead of designing by putting text, images, UI controls, you just design with words, with ideas. So it's an even higher level of abstraction, but one that's quite interesting because often, if you were to search for how to design an app, it's possible that you will find tutorials that will show you how to get, for instance, into Figma, and it will skip this part, which is quite interesting because it's way easier to move an idea in a set of a few words, in one or two sentences around, than to move some UI elements in Figma where you have some technical constraints which start to be put in place. So we have the day summary screen. So it will be a summary of today's recycling, an itemized list, contain an itemized list of today's recycling, view details for a logged item, we imagine by tapping on an item, for instance, and adding new items to trash or recycling. Then another screen for the detail of an item, so what you would get to when you do this interaction here. And so you would have the type of the item, the weight, and the date. Then a calendar view, so the calendar with the current date, summary of the month's item, and viewing a day's recycling log, so a way to navigate through past data using the calendar as the metaphor to navigate through the data. And then the view to the screen to add an item. So where you select whether it's trash or recycling, select a weight or an item, input the detail, recycling information, submit the item, or cancel the entry. And so we can imagine that, I guess it comes later, but we'll have day summary and calendar view being the two main screens. And then from day summary, you can navigate to item detail and also adding an item. And same thing from calendar view, you will be able to navigate maybe to item detail and adding an item, or rather from calendar view, you will be able to see the day summary but of another day. That's also why it starts to be interesting, is when you navigate from one screen to the other, because the relationship are not just like you always go from screen A to B. Maybe you can go from A to B, but also from A to C, and C can also go to B, but then B displays a different kind of data. And that's what can be sometimes very interesting. It's one of the things that can be very interesting to organize, because it's one of the times where you really have to think about it. It's the kind of thing where like a machine would have a hard time finding the right solution, because it's a very it's a humane process. You need to think about how you like to interact with apps. You need to think about what's going to be approachable. You need to think what will also delight your users. So usually it's one of the most interesting and fun parts of the process. And so that's how they suggest that we organize and we outline our screens. So we have the screen title and then the key functions that the screen will contain. And by screen, I think they mean a view that will occupy the full space available on the screen of the device. So it would be the full screen on an iOS app. If you have an iPad app, it will be the full space that's available to the app. So if you are in split screen, it's only part of the screen of the device, but from the point of view of the app, it's the space that's available where the app can display stuff. So now they talk about prototyping, so how you can prototype using Keynote. So let me, you know what? I'm gonna have a look at this other Keynote file. I'm not sure if I can, because I already have one open. I'm not sure if I can open it here. I'm not sure I can open it, but they show, so create a new Keynote file. In the document inspector, choose View Inspector Document. Then under slide size, choose Custom Slide Size. Enter 375 for width and 812 for height. So in order to give it a very vertical iPhone-like aspect ratio. Then open the format inspector and choose View Inspector Format. Under background, select color fill and choose light gray, or another background to contrast with white. At the top of the inspector, use the Change Master button to select the blank master slide. Okay. So that's how you create. Okay, this way your master slide will look something like this. And now create one slide per screen outline and copy your outlines to the slides. To copy a screen outline, click and drag to select all of its boxes. Okay, so they say how to copy and paste from this slide to the other document. And then I guess they will show us how to add links between all of the screens. There is a bit of a coding also part about data and naming. What do they say here? So they talk about how to handle basic data types using struct in Swift. So that's good because they give insight on how a data model is implemented. Once again, that will help you know what is easy and hard when designing features. Okay, now I talk about grouping screens. So group your screen titles into categories and name them. Use the SF Symbols app to choose an icon that best describes each category, then highlight the default screen for each category. The architecture of an app often breaks down into several global categories of activities that users can switch between fluidly. Typically, it will be the tab items inside a tab view. These screen groups will translate into UI elements in the next stage of prototyping. Don't worry if your screens don't fall naturally into multiple categories. Some apps focus on just one activity. Typically would be, I don't know if it's still the case, but for a long time, like the Uber app, you only had one screen, and then the screen, I mean, there is the account screen and etc. But the main feature is that you see the map, and then the screen changes contextually depending on whether you are looking to book a course, whether you have booked a course and the driver is on its way, whether you are pending. I mean, the course is ongoing, you are inside the car, but it's still only one screen, which evolves according to the state that you're in. So here there is the log category, where you will find a calendar view, adding an item, day summary, item detail, and recycling. And the day summary will be the default function. Then challenges and achievements. So we can see the log and then the two gamified features. So challenges and achievements. Kind of makes sense to highlight challenges and achievements because we want to rely a lot on gamification. But once again, it shows that this process on how to create the categories, it's much harder to give a clear-cut criterion for it. There is no one good solution. You could organize views, you could organize screens. There is more than one way to organize a set of screens into categories. I think one of the rules I could still share is that probably you don't want to have more than 4 or 5 categories, especially if you're working on MVP. 3 categories is probably a good number. 2 might even be good. Typically, you could imagine like I don't know, like an app about like doing photo editing could be about one category to take the picture and have some templates, and then another category to access the content that's been saved, basically, and that would be it. I guess you could also, I said that this translates into like items in a tab view. Typically, you will also find like categories, like for instance, like the user profile, which you could put somewhere else, maybe with like a button in the navigation bar, you know, something like that. So it's not always something that translates to a tab view, but still, you still want to have typically the top 2-3 features of your app that will be accessible through a tab view. And so yeah, this is also something where you might want to iterate a bit in the future if you figure out that like the way you grouped features into categories don't really make sense. Definitely, it's something that I mean, basically everything we've seen, it's okay to iterate on them. The only thing to keep in mind is that the later you iterate on something that was defined early on, the more costly it's going to be. And so here it's the template for categories. Okay, then they say so in Keynote you should put the category and together and the parent as the main screen, and then put under it. So you can put like a slide under another slide. You can do like a hierarchy of slides in Keynote. So use this to put the other screens of the same category. Okay. Then a bit of code about types and properties. Skipping this. And then the more interesting part, which is about linking screen, and so having the beginning of a navigation architecture. So draw lines that connect content to the screens you outlined and grouped. Screens within each global category are often organized in a sequential flow from one to the next. So typically the navigation view that we are very familiar with in iOS, where you push and pop screens from the navigation stack. You might notice that some screens have many outgoing lines while others have none. Don't worry, you'll organize them in the next exercise. So here you can see that from the calendar view, when you view a day's recycling log, then you go into the day summary. And from the day summary, you can view the item detail. You can add an item. And here, so recycling information goes into a recycling view, which is like a recycling detail, I could say. And here, these things, they drive you back to the day summary in the sense that they close the screen. So it kind of like reflects how you navigate into from one screen to another indeed. Okay, so then in the prototype, they say to select each of the box and then to add, so you can do that when you click on, you can add a button so that when you click on an item, it's going to link to a given slide number. And so using this, you can implement the links that were defined, so here. Next is wireframe. So a wireframe is a minimal working prototype. By the end of this stage, you'll have a functioning keynote prototype that simulates the behavior of your app, which is pretty cool. You'll build a wireframe from your app's architecture map by converting screen outlines into a sketch of the interface. So the word sketch is super important. It's not a finished version. And it's important that it doesn't feel that finished, because if you have something that feels super polished, then you will feel, and your users also that you will show it to, will feel less free of making changes. When something feels like super polished and someone has put a lot of effort on it, you are less likely to want to make changes. You're more likely to say, okay, I like it or I don't like it, but you will not go into like the finer details of, hey, maybe we could move this around. And so that's why a wireframe is also useful, in addition to also not making you make any effort that's not warranted. So you'll build a wireframe from your app's architecture map, so what we've done just before, by converting screen outlines into a sketch of the interface. This is an organized process, starting with the top-level navigation elements and progressively drilling down to the elements on each screen. So this is important when they say this is an organized process. It kind of means that here you can define rules that basically say that for the same input, you should always get the same output, basically. Whereas we've seen that putting features into categories, there is kind of like an artistic touch, you could say, almost, in the sense that there is no clear-cut criterion or method that you can apply that say for this input, you should always have this output. Here, this is a much more deterministic and a much more also like engineering in a way. It's a much more engineering heavy process rather than what we've seen before, which is much more of a product process, a marketing process, which sometimes you can see it can feel a bit more like literature than engineering, because there is these things of like it's hard to have a clear-cut criterion for what's good or not. And that's what makes it hard but also interesting, because if there was a clear-cut criterion for what will make an app be successful, then we would only have successful apps in the App Store. That would be nice, but also there would be much less opportunities for people to actually try stuff, take risks, and sometimes the risk is rewarded. So they say create tabs. So a tab bar is the most common form of navigation in apps. It lets people quickly switch among different sections of an app. Because it's always at the bottom of the screen and doesn't change, users can rely on the tab bar no matter where they are in the app. And most iOS apps these days, I would say they rely on a tab bar. There was a moment where like at the beginning there were a lot of tab bars, and then people kind of like got tired a bit of it. There was like a tab bar fatigue, where if you had a tab bar, then you were a bit too basic, a bit too vanilla. So apps were having their own menus. Like some apps, like Facebook back then, had the like 9 elements pattern, where you had a grid of 9 features when you open the app. Many apps also had the hamburger menu, where you would press on the button on the top left and it would open a menu on the side. But then, like I would say something like 8 years ago, something like that, tab views came back in force. Apple also advocated a lot for the addition of tab views, and one of the reasons I would say that tab views came back in force is because tab views are very easy to navigate with your thumb. And as the size of the screens on iPhones kept growing, having a menu on the top left, for instance, was becoming a really, really big issue for single-hand navigation. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the tab view made a comeback as the default and the most popular UI pattern that almost all iOS apps use these days. And I think like the Apple apps, they almost all of them use the tab view. You know what? I'm checking. I was looking, so yeah, there are a few apps that don't use the tab view, but because they don't really need one. Typically, I was thinking about like the Notes app. I was like, does the Note app Notes app used a tab view? No, it doesn't, but also because there is only one feature. So it makes sense that since there is only one feature, there is no need for a tab view. So let's see. Okay, so yeah, they show how to put the tab view at the bottom. So remember, in the early slides, there was this link to be able to download all of the graphical assets so that you can then copy and paste them into Keynote. And they say something interesting: never use the tab bar and the toolbar on the same screen. So a toolbar, it's also the bar that you can put at the bottom of the screen to add buttons into it. Typically, what the Notes app does, and indeed, you don't want to have a toolbar and a tab bar because then it kind of like overloads the bottom of the UI, and it's kind of confusing for your users. Okay, so the steps to create a global tab bar. So they say copy and paste a tab bar from the iOS templates plus UI elements Keynote presentation into a slide of your prototype. So it's the slide that they gave us the link at the beginning. Ungroup it by right-clicking and choosing ungroup. Okay. Set the names and icons of the tab items to match your navigation categories. Okay. So here it's log, challenges, and achievements. And for each tab item, add a link from the tab item to the main page for that navigation category. So same thing, using the link to navigate, the button to have a link that navigates to the slide of a given number. Yeah, exactly. So in the Notes app, there is no tab view, but you have these buttons at the bottom, which are what's called a toolbar. Definitely. So there is still a toolbar at the bottom with some actions, but there is no tab view because, like for instance, there is no other feature that's as important as the list of notes. You could imagine, for example, maybe there could be like one feature for like typed notes and one feature for handwritten notes, for instance. It's not how the app works. It has unified everything, but you could imagine in that case that it would make sense to have the two in separate tabs. And the toolbar also happens when showing the note, and in this toolbar you can find some features and some buttons on how to edit the text of the note. Okay, and then they say so group the tab bar again, so that when you modify it and when you move it all together. And then you just copy and paste the tab bar on all of the other views. Okay. Then it's gonna be about adding navigation. So here they say find linear paths between the screens in your app map. So it's kind of like building on the arrows that we've implemented before. So linear paths between screens are usually managed through hierarchical navigation. So the push and pop that we are very familiar with when we implement iOS apps. The navigation bar, so at the top, manages a sequence of hierarchical screens. Choosing an item on screen pushes the next one in from the right, and tapping the back button allows the user to go to the previous screen. The title of the current screen appears in the center of the navigation bar. The back button appears on the left and often takes the title of the previous screen. The right side of a navigation bar can contain actions such as add and search. So you can put buttons even in the navigation bar. In the following Keynote exercise, you'll add navigation bars to your prototype. So basically putting the title, so here summary, and you can see that when you click here, so on viewing a detail, so on viewing a day's recycling log, it shows you today, and you can go back to the calendar view, for instance. All right. So then there's a step to do it. So it's the same idea than before. You just copy and paste from the Keynote document where you have all of the iOS UI components available. Then creating modals. So identify focused activities and create modal screens. Modality is a design technique that helps people focus on a self-contained task or set of closely related options. a model presents content in a temporary mode that's separate from the user's previous context and requires an explicit action to exit. Always include a button that dismisses the model view in the main screen, the navigation bar, or both. For example, you might use a done or cancel button. Including a button ensures that the model view is accessible to assistive technologies and provides an alternative to dismissal gestures. So a model, as they say, it's a way to present on the screen an activity that is very focused. So typically, adding a new item to a list of items is the typical use case for a model view. It can be also having a look at some very specific data. For instance, when you're on the App Store app and you tap on your profile, at some point it shows a model, and on this model you can see your subscriptions, you can download previously downloaded apps, you can see how much credit you have in the App Store if you've redeemed a gift card. You can also see the updates that are available. So it's not just about creating items, but it can also be about presenting data that's completely independent from where you are currently in the app. For instance, I'm taking again the example of the App Store, but you can open your profile from several places into the App Store, and so it makes sense to use a model because presenting the profile is not related to where you were already in the App Store. Like when you are on the home screen and you tap on an app, it makes sense to push it and to navigate to it because you are going from a screen that showed a piece of data to the detail of that piece of data. But when you have your profile icon on every screen or most screens of the app, it makes more sense to show the profile using a model because the data of your profile isn't specifically linked to the current screen. It's a bit different if you show the icon to see your profile only on a specific screen, like your content screen, for instance. Then in that case, pushing it down the view hierarchy makes sense because the data closely relates to the place where you accessed it from. Okay, so you add more buttons in order to navigate from one screen to the other. And then it's about adding interface elements. So using standard iOS elements to convert your screen outlines into wireframes. iOS users expect standard interface elements in apps when presented with information, controls, or navigational elements. And iOS developers consistently adopt a set of common practices which are documented in the Human Interface Guidelines. Think about the fact that all of the apps from Apple, typically they follow the same UI pattern, and when you're new to iOS, it's a bit like of a learning curve, but once you've learned how to use one app from Apple, usually when a new one comes, you also quite easily know how to use it. And that's thanks to these common UI guidelines. It's very important because by adhering to these guidelines, then it makes it way easier for your users to start using your app immediately without the need for an instruction manual or a tutorial. And that's quite important because think about if you had to read an instruction manual for each app, you would use not as many apps as you use today. And basically, one of the reasons why the app ecosystem is so successful is because there are these common patterns, these common idioms in how the UI is laid out, and it helps a lot in making apps feel intuitive to users. So here you can see the summary here as a chart, the itemized list of today's recycling as a list right here, and then adding new items as the plus button. So you translate features, functions into graphical elements displayed on the screen that the user can see, that the user can interact with. So then it's about doing it into Keynote. Okay, then a bit of code about event-based programming. So how to answer to interactions from the user, which makes sense because we are at the point where we started to lay out buttons in the UI. So once again, I'm going quickly over it, but I would encourage you that you read it into detail if you don't know about the topic at hand. And for us, in the prototype stage, we are now on the refine step. So now that you have a functioning prototype, it's time to apply important interface design guidelines. By the end of this stage, your prototype will feel at home on iOS and in the hands of your users. A solid interface design is critical to a good iOS experience. You'll learn about the most important properties of a good interface and apply those lessons to make your prototype a pleasure to use. Okay. So size, tap, targets. Users should be able to tap the icons or buttons in your app. If the tap target is too small, users will have trouble triggering it. If it's too big, it can interfere with another button that's close to it. Try to maintain a minimum tappable area of 44 by 44 points for all controls. That's super important, and that can be deceiving when you are designing your app on a Mac and you're using a trackpad with a mouse, which is much more precise than when you use your actual thumb. If you make a button too small and you cannot close it, it becomes very frustrating. I think we all have an example that we can relate to, is whenever there is an ad in an app and we want to close it, and the button to close the ad is so small that we fail to trigger it, and maybe we click on the ad instead and open a link. It's super frustrating, so you don't want to do this inside your app. So you want to make sure that the tappable area is as wide as possible, and you can see that here, they even make it a bit wider. So you definitely want the full green area to be tappable, not just the part where there is a text, but it might also make sense to even add a bit extra space around the button. This way, it's even easier to interact with the button. And think about people who might have some disabilities, maybe some people who just like their thumb is broken, or maybe like they're shaking a bit, and the more easy a button is to interact with, as long as it doesn't conflict with interacting with another button, the more useful it is, because if your users struggle to interact with your button, then your button has no purpose at all. Like, the purpose of a button is literally to be tapped on when a user wants to trigger the action. So if tapping the button is a challenge, then the main feature of the button is a challenge, and so it's not a good button. So super good of Apple to highlighting that. And what can be interesting is that you can try to maybe go into your favorite apps and try to see how much leeway you have when you want to trigger a button. Like, try to tap the button slightly outside of its area and see whether it works or not. Try it on different apps and try to see if you get different results. I've even seen people saying that basically your buttons should always take the largest tappable area that they can, as long as they don't conflict with another UI element, because this way it makes them, it kind of like maximizes the usability of the button. It might be a bit extreme. For instance, here we might not want the button enter code to take like all of this space available below the text and image for the tappable area, but adding a bit of extra space on the left and right can make a lot of sense, especially if you're in the context of an app that's being used, for instance, that's being used in challenging circumstances. I mentioned disabilities, but it might not be just that. Remember that we said that the app has to be used when your hands are full, because you might be holding like some trash. Then it makes sense that the buttons are easy tappable, because the user is in a situation where they are temporarily handicapped by the fact that they are holding a bunch of stuff. So that's something that you want to take into account. Talk about inset content. So many actions in iOS require the user to use a swipe gesture to trigger them. People use swipe gestures at the bottom edge of the display to access features of the home screen and app switcher. Like, for instance, when you swipe here from the bottom, you access the home screen on iOS. These gestures could cancel custom gestures you implement in this area. The far corners of the screen can be difficult areas for people to reach comfortably. In general, content should be centered and symmetrically inset, so it looks right in any orientation and isn't clipped by the rounded corners. Hidden by a sensor housing or obscured by the indicator for accessing the home screen. What's nice is that what they call the sensor housing, it can be either the notch or the dynamic island. So it's nice to see Apple coming out for some kind of like common terminology for both the notch and the dynamic island. And so you can see that there is this idea of like in blue is the safe area, and you can see that this part at the bottom of the screen is not part of the safe area because it's why you have this bar which will take priority, because for a user, being able to exit your app is a high priority gesture, and it will always override any gesture in your app. And then you have the margins on the side, because if your text touches the sides of the screen, it's not visually pleasing, and it's not easy to read either. And these things are also laid out in much more details in the human interface guidelines, which are available on Apple's website. Then judge weight and balance. Large items catch the eye and appear more important than smaller ones. They are also easier to tap, which is especially important when an app is used in distracting surroundings, such as in the kitchen or a gym. In general, place principal items in the upper half and near the left side of the screen in a left to right reading context. So sometimes people also call it like the Z reading context, in the sense that when someone sees a screen, they tend to read it in a Z, like looking at the first line first, then a diagonal like that, and then here. It means that anything that's here tends to be ignored by the user when they just skim through the content of the screen. And so here, this is the content which will be super visible to the user. By the way, it happens more often than not that something that we think is super obvious is actually not seen by the users, because it's placed in a way where maybe there is some kind of more important information just placed just before it, and so this other information overloads the user's cognitive capacities, and the information just below gets completely ignored. It might seem weird, but it happens more often than we think, and in a way, it's kind of like what happens also during a magic trick, like you get distracted by the magician and you don't see something that is super obvious had you not been distracted. The same thing can happen when you design an app and play against you. So it's very important to be mindful of that, and to be aware that when you design a screen, you will usually focus on it heavily for several minutes, maybe even like 1 hour. But when your user will see the screen, they will not give it their full attention, and they will look at it maybe for like 1 or 2 seconds. So this big discrepancy can lead to a situation where it's very hard to build an idea to relate to how users are using your app, because users are using your app in a way that is completely different to how you relate to the app. I mean, users relate to your app in a very different way than as a designer you relate to your app. They spend way less time, they have way less attention, so it's good to be mindful and to stay mindful of that. Then a bit more code about composing views together, and we're back on checking alignment. So alignment makes an app look neat and organized, helps people focus while scrolling, and makes it easier to find information. Indentation and alignment can also indicate how groups of content are related. So the idea is that content should be aligned in a way that is visually pleasing, and by grouping elements together, you kind of give a sense of hierarchy and structure to your screen. And if you look at apps, you will see it happen all the time. Like for instance, the music app, it structures things around, for instance, horizontal sliders. Same thing for Netflix. When you open Netflix, you have like the list of all of the horizontal sliders, and then you have the movies in each of the horizontal lists, and each list has a given theme. I think the Apple TV app also works the same way. That's very important because this gives structure, and as a user, you need to have structure, because you cannot, as a user, afford to spend 1 minute to understand each piece of data in the screen. You need to take some cues to understand how the data is structured, so that you can focus first on the structure, and then, if it makes sense for you, focus on the data, but in a second time. Now it's about styling. So the last stage of prototyping is defining the personality of your app to set it apart from its peers. By the end of this stage, you'll have a prototype that's as close as it can come to a real app, one that you'll be proud to share with your testers. Style encompasses a range of elements from color and fonts to icons. Now you can use your imagination to create a cohesive identity for your app. To be honest, your imagination is good, but also one of the skills of a designer is knowing what should go together and what shouldn't go together, what will be harmonious and what will be disharmonious. So I would be very, very, very careful here, because it's super easy to make a mess when it's not your job. So defining the personality. So complete the style guide template to apply to your app. Picking out colors, typography, images, and icons, in other words, branding your app can be fun. But it's important to keep accessibility in mind when choosing these UI elements. At least they give you a layout by saying, okay, you should have one primary color, one secondary color, one main font, and the fact that the number is limited, it kind of prevents you from going crazy and then using one different font for each screen of your app. So San Francisco typeface is a typeface, so a font designed to be consistent with the simple and clean iOS aesthetic. System fonts are legible and neutral. SF symbols, so Apple created an icon set that supports dynamic type and the bold text activity feature. So SF symbols are really nice because it gives you a lot of icons available in iOS natively, and these save you a lot of time, to be honest. And then colors, so iOS offers a range of system colors that automatically adapt to vibrancy and changes in accessibility settings. Okay, designing the icon. I think I will skip a bit over it because I would rather cover a bit the test part before I end the live stream when we get close to 2 hours. So with design and prototype, now it's time to test. So testing your prototype will help you understand whether your ideas and assumptions are correct. In the test phase, you'll architect your test, create a plan to execute them, and prepare by gathering users and creating checklists. So here we're talking about user testing. We are not talking about writing unit tests. Let's be clear on that. Okay, so architect. The first part of testing your app is understanding what and how to test. By the end of this stage, you'll have a plan that you can use to write your test scripts. You've defined your app's goals. How will you determine whether you've achieved them? You've implemented a prototype. How do you expect it to be used? You'll define tests that will answer those questions, and you'll also take a step back to think about setting expectations, yours and those of your users. So define tests. For each goal that users want to accomplish with your app, define the steps they'll take to accomplish it and describe any existing flow the user may be in. Before you design your test, you need to decide what's important to test. Your test will teach you what users find useful, as well as how well you've designed your app. You'll also learn about the assumptions you made along the way. If you select the right set of tests with your broad goals in mind, the result will help you draw clear conclusions about where you're on track and where you need to correct course. I'm glad that we find this course correction term that I had used early on. And also, this is what we call validating your prototype. If you ever see the word validating, this is what it means. This paragraph here, the last one, describes what validating means. So users want to do this with your app. So add trash or recycling weight to a day. The user will need to have completed these steps first. So have either trash or recycling to throw out. So like the prerequisites, which could be a real world prerequisites. Users need to complete these critical tasks. So classify whether the item is trash or recycling, estimate the weight of the item, submit the entry. So it's the task that users will need to do using your app this time. Okay, and then create user journeys. So for each features you want to test, use a copy of your screen outline map to create a user journey map. Number and label each step from your previous exercises, attaching each to the screen that the user will be on. A journey map visually represents what a user will need to do to complete a task, so how they will navigate across the app. These might be interactions like taps or swipes, but they may also include taking a picture, speaking to the microphone, or bringing the device close to an object in the real world, for example, an NFC reader. And the idea is that you write how you expect your users to journey through the app to complete the task. What's interesting to see is whether their actual journey matches your predicted journey. They might get confused and never reach the goal. They might reach the goal with a different journey. They might follow the journey but with some extra steps. It will be interesting to understand why it deviates from what you had in mind on your end. Then define a process, so summarize the requirements and parameters of your test. Before you build the test themselves, you should create a standardized process for how you'll test individual users. Having consistent data is critical to a successful analysis of the test result, in the sense that you want your test in a way to always follow kind of the same framework, because if each user tests the app in a very different setup, then it's very hard to draw some common conclusion. It's hard to create an average of very different things which cannot be compared to each other. Or rather, to say it otherwise, in order to create an average, you need to add stuff together. But if you end up adding apple and oranges, then your average will probably not have a lot of meaning. So, for instance, you say that you plan to test on testing these user journeys. So here the list of the user journeys. You will record your findings using paper, video, audio, screen recording, whatever. You will show your prototype either by screen share or in person. You will conduct the test at time, date, and location. You will need the following equipment: so MacBook, iPhone, chair, desk, camera, tripod. So it's about logistics, basically. The person that will take notes and record, the person that will do the user test. Very important, either have some automated recording and or note taking and then focus on the user test. But don't try to do both at the same time, because it's very hard to guide a user through a test and also take notes. If you try to do it, you will do a poor job. The user might feel that you're neglecting them. You might miss out on some important things that the user will say, but it will be low signals. So very important to split the responsibility into two, and usually this right here can be automated, for instance, with screen sharing and audio recording. Okay, so planning and introduction. So how you will introduce each user to the test. That's very important to do it, honestly, because if you introduce your app a different way, then once again each user will approach the app with a different set of mind, and that might be bad for reproducibility. So that's something to keep in mind. So having the requirement to have a short introduction about yourself and your project and explain the goals of the test. They say that participants can be intimidated by the word test, so be sure to let your user know that there are no wrong answers and any feedback is useful feedback. Also, what people say is to not say that not ask like, give me feedback about this thing that I've built, but rather, here's an app, what do you think about it? Because people might not want to, say something that will hurt you, and so they will keep negative feedback to themselves, but of course, it's not what you want. What else might make your participant feel uncomfortable? How might you mitigate those feelings? If you're recording, be sure to get consent, explain why it's beneficial, consider what you'll do if they decline to consent. That's a good point, because then if you need to have a recording to have notes, what do you do if there is no recording? Participants usually want to know how much time they need to commit to the testing session, so how long do you think it will take? You should definitely need to define it beforehand. Could be 10 minutes, could be 20 minutes, could be half an hour. An hour, we're starting to get into like a very long session, I would say. Maybe I'm not an expert on the topic, but I wouldn't go more than half an hour, to be honest, because after that I think people probably like get a bit like tired and lose focus, to be honest. But once again, I'm not an expert. Then we have a bit about scripting. So now that you've planned your testing, it's time to focus on the details. By the end of this stage, you'll have a complete set of test scripts. You'll define the flow of your test to keep the user engaged and oriented, dig into the kinds of questions each test can answer, and prepare for the unexpected. So how do you write the outline for a script? So describe each test and the order they'll be conducted. Be sure to include any contextual information the user will need to complete the task successfully. Your testing script should tell a story that the user can relate to. The order of tasks should create a natural flow that puts the user into the right frame of mind and keeps them engaged throughout the process. Meaning, don't start with a super obscure task that is like hidden deep inside your app. Start with the core use case and then move on into more specialized features. Where possible, put your tests in the order the user would encounter them in their everyday lives, so kind of like what I was getting at. Remember that some tasks are more critical to test than others. What are the most important features to test? You might want to test those first in case you run out of time. So once again, the importance of prioritization. For tests that don't flow naturally from one to the next, it's especially important to provide context so you don't interrupt the flow of the script. Make sure you identify those situations and think carefully about how you keep the user focused and oriented. Typically, if you need to reset the app, delete the app and reinstall it, it's very important to share it with the user because it might be very unsettling for the user for the basic reason that it's going to mess with the mental model of the app that they've been building since the beginning of the test. So for instance, the sequence of tasks to test, so add recycling or trash to daily summary, discover information about recycling numbers, check the achievements, understand challenges to being more environmentally conscious, and content that should be provided. So for the first test, give the participant a group of objects that are trash and recycling, so providing them with real-world props. And for the check their achievements, users should reach the achievement when they successfully add a recycling. Okay. And then, so the script for each test, and I think I will stop at that. So for each test, determine which questions and observations you'll use. You can choose from different types of questions when building a testing script. You might use one or more of them for a given test, and you might ask them during a particular user journey. Refer back to your user journeys. They'll help you decide when and how to gather your data. So for instance, in this script, we want to understand more about will users be able to successfully sort and enter trash and recycling into the app? So is the UI intuitive enough, for instance? We could answer this by having users complete a rank order of the screen. So looking at this screen, rank the items you see from the most to least important for discarding trash or recycling. So asking the user, for instance, let's say that you're using this app to help you discard trash. On the screen that you're seeing, what seems to be the most important part that's relevant to this goal. So we could gain insight for this by having users complete a task observation. Your participant should be starting from a screen that they are most likely to be on when starting the task. Observe and note where they're successful or unsuccessful completing parts of the task. To gather more information, ask what they think about completing the task. So if you were to discard these items, how might you record that in the app? And once again, writing these testing scripts is definitely a skill that needs to be learned because it's very easy to have a confusing wording, but it's only when trying it and seeing how users react in the real world that you're able to build intuition into how you should correctly phrase such a script. We can dig deeper about why a user makes decisions by asking about expectations. Your participant should look at the screen and talk through what they are seeing and what they expect each element will do. For example, if a participant mentions the plus icon, you can use it as an opportunity to ask more questions on how it might work. You can also ask your users to think out loud. Usually this works pretty well, especially if you're doing the test remotely using services like usertesting.com, for instance. So when looking at this screen, what do you expect you'll be able to complete on this screen, making them think out loud? And to be honest, I think I will stop here because, let me see. So we are on slide 110 and in total, oh no, there are only 126 slides. Okay, so we're almost done. So never mind. I'm going to cover everything because there are only like 15 slides left, so might as well do everything. So after you've written the scripts, you want to anticipate errors. So make a plan for what you'll do when the user gets stuck or asks you a question. It's especially important not to lead the user through a test, so not to give them directions which are too precise. because you won't be able to do that for actual users who download your app from the App Store. You'll be most tempted to step in when something goes wrong. Your interactions can bias the user and rob you of important insights, so be sure you've planned for how to ask and answer questions to minimize their influence on the test. So participants who get stuck completing a task will often ask you for help. It's important to dig deeper into why they're stuck, ask things such as what do you expect it will do? How might you get your user back on track without leading them? What questions will help you better understand why they're stuck in a task? And it's likely that you will probably need to do one first user test that might be a bit of a struggle in order to build the intuition on how you can help users get unstuck, to be honest. When participants are completing a task, there might be smaller elements that you can test. Things like icon recognition, text clarity, and color contrast can impact how the user completes the task. Consider what small tests can happen while a participant completes a task. So, for instance, it could be like, let's say, when they say consider what small tests can happen while a participant completes a task, what could it be? Oh, I think they mean that during a big task, you can ask things like, for instance, the user tapped on an icon, asking like, why did you tap on that icon? Why did it feel like the right choice to access? Why did it feel like the right choice to move towards like the goal you've been tasked with? These kind of things, I guess. When participants get quiet, they're usually figuring things out. You want to talk through what they're experiencing. How might you gently remind them to talk through their thought process? Where might they need a moment to think during the test? That's a good thing, because you need to know when you should like stay silent, but you also need to know when you should like move in. And it's once again, it's something that it's hard to figure out, so you will probably need to do a bit of trial and error during a few sessions. Next, about preparing. So you're almost there. By the end of this stage, you'll be ready to test your prototype. The quality of your data depends on the users you test with, so it's important to select them carefully. And you'll want to make sure that you're ready right at the start to provide each participant with an enjoyable experience. So gather users, make a list of the users you'll enroll in your testing, and plan a date and location for each one. The information you gathered in the discover phase will be beneficial during testing. Select users who are directly affected by the challenges you identified and who would be most likely to use your app. It takes at least 3 people to begin to see patterns in user tests, so be sure to enroll enough participants so that you can accommodate a cancellation or two. Or you could also do what's called like guerrilla testing, where you go like in the street, you go to a fast food, or you ask users like, are you okay to test my app if I pay for your meal, for instance? It's things that happen, and some pretty successful apps have been known to do this kind of testings. Typically, I know people who worked on ride-sharing apps like Uber or Lyft, and doing guerrilla testing in the street kind of made sense, because you are actually using these apps when you are on the street and looking for a ride. So for them, it made perfect sense. Perform last check. So use the checklist to double check that you're ready to start testing. Be sure that the testing script will run smoothly when talking to users. Use this checklist to complete the dry run of your testing script. So are all of your questions non-leading? Can you run a script in your sketch or prototype smoothly? So try to run the script yourself to make sure that there is no blocker, just like you would test a feature that you've implemented from end to end. Do you have a plan for how you'll restart the task process if the user gives up? So do you have an easy way to reset the app, for instance? Does your testing script cover the features that are most important to the goal? Do you have a plan for where you'll continue the testing, remote versus in person? And now it's about the next step, which is validate. So you'll have a lot of information to digest after testing your prototype. It's important to summarize and draw the correct conclusion from your testing data so that you know how to improve your app. You'll start by formatting your data to make it digestible. Then you'll summarize your observations by discovering relationships between them. Then you'll zoom out to root causes and identify core issues. So how do we gather notes? So create succinct notes from your observations for each participant. After user testing, you'll have a lot of raw data. Before you draw any conclusions, it's important to convert it to a consistent format. Don't worry about how to organize or categorize it. The more you can narrow your observations down to single focused data points, the easier it will be to organize them. This activity could involve transferring and splitting up written notes, summarizing survey answers, or analyzing video or audio. You might need many notes for each participant. If so, consider organizing the notes by task to be completed per participant. So here we have the name, and then we have some raw data, like wanted to use the scale because she has one at home, able to enter trash and recycling, wished she could enter trash and recycling on the same screen, unclear on what classifies something as recycling, etc., etc. Then form key insights. So look through your notes and group similar ones. Summarize those groups as key insights into your users' behaviors. You understand why they said that you need to have at least 3 different user tests in order to be able to draw meaningful conclusions. An affinity diagram helps you visualize similarities across participants and identify patterns. As you group your notes, the patterns you see should help you draw some initial conclusions about your data. Don't analyze the reason for user behavior yet, just focus on finding themes. So here we have unclear on what classified something as recycling. I wonder what the I is for next to recycling. Or I wish that information was somewhere more visible. I don't know if this is recycling or not. What does the 5 mean? And so it's under the theme, users are confused about whether an item is recyclable. Then drawing conclusions. So for each task, summarize your key insights and review them in light of your assumptions to draw overall conclusions. The final phase of analyzing your results is to look for big patterns. Identifying these patterns will guide you toward decisions about iterating on your design. When drawing conclusions from key insights, keep things general. Focus on root causes rather than particular issues. So in the example, we tested this task. Do users discover information about what's considered recycling? We expected users would complete the task by tapping the eye icon to reveal more information. We observed this instead. Users are confused about whether an item is recyclable. We've made these conclusions. The eye icon isn't well understood. Users want a more prominent reminder of what the recycling numbers mean. Users have difficulty remembering recycling numbers. It's important to also tell users where to find recycling numbers on products. So I guess recycling numbers is a code to say in which bin an item should go, I guess. Might be an American thing because I don't think we have something equivalent in France, to be honest. Like the wording recycling number doesn't ring a bell at all to me. And then iterate. So look closely at your first prototype and you'll see a world-changing app beginning to take form. Now comes the critical phase of any design, working towards that vision by applying all you've learned during your design process. You'll use the conclusions from your analysis as a guide to reevaluate choices you made throughout your app design journey. Then you'll revisit different elements of your design, looking for opportunities to make improvements, large and small. Okay, so numbers are classes of formulae that can be combined for recycling. Okay, so yeah, definitely we don't have anything that's close to that in France. But it's very interesting because it shows that if you want to make such an app, you definitely want to focus on a specific geography that you are familiar with, because it shows that what's true for recycling, I guess, in the US doesn't make sense at all for another country like France. So this is a very good insight. And it's typically the kind of insight that doing user testing would reveal if done well. So organize your conclusions. Before you use your conclusions to revisit steps in your design process, group similar conclusions. Seeing important themes will help you define where to focus your efforts. Your conclusions may range from surfacing important content to making it easier to navigate the app and reducing visual clutter. You might also discover that you've misunderstood your users or you've omitted a critical element of your test plan. So, for instance, here there are some conclusions about interface elements. So the eye icon isn't well understood. It's too hard to find the button to add a new item. Graphs and charts don't have enough contrast. You can see that they were surfaced by different goals and different tasks, and they relate to different features, but there is still the common link around interface elements not being optimal according to our users. Same thing for navigation, with the flow for adding a new recycling item requires too many actions. Adding multiple items requires the user to repeat the same flow for each one. Graphs, only these two. And one about wording. Many users don't understand the phrase recycling number, myself included. So interesting to see that these things are all very different, and also they can be solved separately. And probably that the way to solve all of the things in the interface element will share some commonalities, but the wording will have no commonality, and it's a different task that needs to be handled separately. And then go back define. So if your groupings include the following topics, consider revisiting these elements of define. So define being the step that we did at the beginning. So if you heard comments like this, your competitor did a better feature, then you need to research competitors better and find differentiators. Needing to use two hands considering diversity, because we didn't consider diversity in the sense that all of the situations in which people will be using your app. Of course, diversity means much more than that, but it's one of the components of diversity, and not the one that we might be thinking more, thinking about the most, or thinking about first when we hear diversity. Issue not being solved. So you need to observe, analyze causes, and prioritize features. It means that the issue of the user is not solved yet by your app. Wish for a different feature. So same thing, observe, analyze causes, and define new key functions. A feature not being recognized. So maybe prioritize feature in the sense that maybe what you've implemented in your prototype doesn't make sense yet for your user, and maybe you should deprioritize this because it might be too early on. Or on the other hand, something felt like really missing, and so you need to prioritize it much more. Okay, so these are for the define part. So when you are, this is what should make you iterate and go back to the define part. These are other commands that should make you iterate also, but this time on the prototyping part. So for instance, unable to understand a task, then it means you need to rework how you have outline screens, group screens, and link screens together. There is a problem with your app architecture. Unable to read content, so it's more about the style, the relative weight of the content on the screen. Unable to complete a task, so this is something more about navigation, modals, interface elements, but basically there is a problem with your UI. A feature not being recognized, so adding interface elements. So interesting that the same command can lead to two different things. Here it's more like a feature not being identified, I guess, or rather a feature is here, but users were not able to identify it and so interact with it. Disconnect of what the app icon means, so you need to design a new app icon, and that's very hard, to be fair. Didn't understand categories, so the way your app is organized at the top level doesn't make sense, and so you need to go back to the outline screens, group screens, and link screens step. Also, you might need to iterate on your test. So if your user was confused as to what you wanted them to do, then you need to iterate on your test. If they say, I know that because you called it this, then you need to anticipate errors. And maybe you also you were asking leading questions and you need to improve on that. and the script didn't match the thought process. So you need to rewrite your script because you wrote a script that maybe made sense for you with all of the knowledge that you have accumulated of the domain. But for a user who doesn't have all of that knowledge, it's possible that it didn't make sense at all because there was probably you had too much context and you forgot that the user has way less context about what you're doing, and so you need to introduce things much more slowly and much more progressively. Okay, I think it's the last slide because 126. And so they say you don't need to prior experience to dive into creating apps for Apple platforms. Apple's app development curriculum. Okay, so it's like you can learn more about how to create apps. So Swift Coding Club, it seems to be more of a coding exercises, I would say. And here the app showcase guide. Okay, so it's mostly about education. I don't know which part are resources that are available on demand, which are in person. You will need to have a closer look, but you might want to have a look to see what they can offer if you feel that it's something that can help you achieve your goals. And indeed, I think this is the last. This is the last slide. All right. So as this is the last slide, this is also the end of this live stream. Thank you for following it. It was very interesting to do this kind of like completely new format where I take a resource, methodological resource from Apple, and I try to comment it and discover it live. It was quite interesting. My feedback is that everything that I've seen makes total sense. I would definitely recommend that you apply this method. One thing that's worth noting is that this method went actually. I call this live stream how to design and build an app, and it's more how to design and prototype an app. To be fair, the part about building an app wasn't part of the method, but it's the part that's covered by all of the other tutorials from Apple. So it kind of makes sense that it didn't cover it here. But honestly, everything I've seen makes sense. I can see definitely some inspiration, some similarities with other existing software development and software design methods. I could also see some similarities with other methods like design thinking that rely a lot on the ability to emphasize with users. So I would say, I think it's a safe bet to follow this methodology. Personally, I would recommend to also read a bit more about design thinking, and also if you want to move further into the implementation part, you probably want to read the Lean Startup book, because it talks about on how you should do the same thing, but once you have released something that's available in production, and how you prioritize new features, how you gather feedback from your existing live users through analytics. And I think that's super interesting because it's the part that is not covered by what we've seen. I guess I've said all I wanted to say. I think I just need to say, once again, thank you if you followed live. Thank you if you watched the replay and you're still here at the end after more than 2 hours of replay. If you have any feedback on this live stream, please let me know in the comments. And I guess I will just need to say, well, see you probably next week for another live stream on a topic that might be one of the new beta features of Xcode 16 on macOS Sequoia. So see you next week. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.